All right.
Can that be seen then later on the Facebook page?
Yeah, so this can be watched later on Facebook as well. Yeah, you move over because we want you in, most importantly, and then I'll just sit in the background there. Right, yeah. So yeah, so welcome anyone who's watching online and our lovely audience in South Ruislip Library tonight. Thank you so much for making the effort to come out. Yeah, it's tricky nowadays. It's tricky. But yes, my name is Lara. I work in Hillingdon Libraries. I probably have met a few of you before, and I am really, really, really happy to introduce wonderful author Ellen Alpsten. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for coming.
Yes. And you're going to be talking about Tsarina and Tsarina's Daughter. So yeah, so tell us a little bit about you.
Well, I'm here tonight to speak about my girls, how I call them, Tsarina and Tsarina's Daughter. Where shall I start? I grew up in the Kenyan highlands and was introduced to storytelling very early because we had no TV. My godmother sent me a book parcel every month. My elder brothers were in boarding school. I had lots of pets, 3 cats, 4 dogs, a wounded serval cat, a stroppy polo pony. At some point, we even had a baby crocodile, which swam in our bathtub, and then we put it out to get some sun, and then suddenly it had disappeared. And today, we still don't know if, you know, a sort of a raptor got it, a bird of prey got it, because it was like this long, or if some of the staff took it and boiled a nice soup with it. We do not. I remember being quite relieved when that baby crocodile disappeared. But mostly I sort of sat my pets down, I dressed them up. You have to imagine the cats like very little hats. They were very happy. And they had to listen to my stories because storytelling in Africa, of course, has a huge tradition. If you are, you know, 100 years back, a settler sitting around the fire, or if you are part of a tribe in a kraal and there's no written memory, but you pass on stories. This is what storytelling is, and it's something that transcends age, race, or gender. And I think very early on, I found that lovely. And when we moved to Europe, these were very long and very lonely teenage years because I was different. We moved to this tiny village. My father's a vet. We moved to this tiny village that had more cows than human inhabitants. And of course, I was just very different. And it was really paradise lost when I arrived there. And my only solace was going to the local library, really with a washing basket. I still picture it was orange plastic, you know, pure 1980s. Yeah, really my age, pure 1980s. And I would just sweep those shelves empty, and mostly historical fiction, because no other genre offers this triple E of entertainment, education, and escapism. And mostly the heroine finds their place too. So I found that attractive. And everybody who loves historical fiction probably remembers reading that one novel that made a difference for them. And especially the big classics, you know, I, Claudius from Robert von Ranke-Graves, Sinue the Egyptian, Forever Amber, Angelique, Désirée, which is still the world's second best-selling historical novels, Gone with the Wind, you know, for all its sort of difficult slavery associations these days. These are amazing books. And feeling that, you know, that I can today write something that offers somebody else perhaps that solace and that triple E is fantastic. And so I'm delighted to be here speaking about my girls.
Wonderful. No, thank you. So I do have some questions to ask you. And we will also have some readings as well, but if anyone wants to submit questions either online or from the audience, like, feel free whenever, just chime in. It's no problem. So Tsarina is the first ever novel, if not book, about Catherine I of Russia. How did you discover this amazing character?
It is absolutely unbelievable. That there was never anything written about this incredible double Cinderella story, about this woman who rises from serf to empress, and equally Russia's transformation from a backward nation to the beginnings of the superpower we know today. And I discovered her age 13 reading a book called Germans and Russians. And these two people have really a millennial hate-love relationship. And hardly any two people have suffered so much historically under political regimes due to their own choices or not, and still share this very innate understanding of beauty and tragedy in their creation. even if you go today, if you travel to, I remember traveling to Uzbekistan for one of my first assignments as a journalist, and there were villages that looked like straight out of Bavaria, because people had arrived there 1,000 years ago, but had taken all their habits with them, the little wooden houses and the neatness and the flowers, and it's fascinating. And in that book, one chapter was devoted to her, because she was born as a German serf in the Baltic states, which were then under Swedish dominance. And through the Great Northern War, which is a massive conflict, crucial for the formation of Europe, which most people have never heard about, the Baltics became Russian. And when I read that story, it's just this, as you say, it's the ultimate Cinderella story. And later, when I came to London for my first job, and I wasn't very happy, I hardly earned any money, I didn't know anybody, and I started writing for real, I remembered her story. And then I was just astounded to see that nothing, no thesis, no biography, nothing. So I started to write every evening in my little cubbyhole, the House of Horrors in Hammersmith, as we called it. And that's why I sat and wrote. It's a very London story, I suppose.
So, and also, sort of before we actually go in and you do a reading from the book, what is your link? And you can expand a bit on that, your link to Russia.
So as I said, there is a sort of love-hate relationship. And my father grew up in the GDR, and before you arrived, I told, so he was born in 1939. As a child, when the streets were flagged for Hitler's birthday, he thought they were flagged for him because his birthday was a day before. And he still remembers he was in this little, very prosperous town, which was then 10 kilometers away from the later on border, and which was initially in the American sector. And he still remembers the terror when the American tanks left and the Soviets moved in the same evening, because they had renegotiated territory. And he equally says that he would still recognize each army by their smell, the Nazis, the Americans, and the Russians, and that they all. In Stalin, an act of revenge, sent in, as in a first wave, he sent in the first he could find. And these were people who were astounded to say that loos were made out of porcelain. They could not believe it, that, people pooed on porcelain. That was something they had never seen from the backwaters where Stalin found them. So it was a complete shock. And my grandfather was a surgeon, so my father was not allowed to study. They told him he could become a car mechanic because, everybody should be a peasant and a worker. And academics, they had enough. And so at the age of 16, he just packed his backpack and fled through a night forest, just with his passport. And I just was in Germany last week. And, now with everything that's happening in the Ukraine, I realize, and he has little mannerisms. For instance, he always buys gold. As soon as he has got spare money, he buys gold, but he only buys very small denominations. And he very seriously says to me, what if you just have to buy a loaf of bread? You don't want to break up a Krugerrand, do you? Krugerrand is an ounce of gold. It's a special gold coin. And I spoke to him. I said, I think if you have been a refugee, if you just have to pack that bag and leave everything behind, it's such a shock to the system. Even as a German coming to Germany from east to west, it never leaves you. And he told me some stories, stuff he had suffered from his own family who was supposed to take him in. It's just shocking. Yeah, so if I see the images now, I just so feel for these people. And to a point that I think, what would I pack? What would I put in that backpack? It's horrific. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. And it's something that's going on right now. To thousands
and it's
of people
like us. If you see footage from Kiev 6 weeks ago, this looks like Berlin, it looks like Dusseldorf, it looks like Paris, it looks like London. And if you're there in Germany, it's much closer. My friend runs the Gates Foundation in Berlin, and she said to me, it takes 4 minutes for a nuclear missile from Moscow to reach Berlin. I mean, what do you do in 4 minutes? Nothing.
But yeah, there's nothing we can do.
So they're much, much closer to the whole show.
Yeah. And obviously it's much more on there.
Yeah, it's much more on their radar.
Yeah.
But sort of, yeah.
No.
It's just, it's important to speak about these real life things too, and actually make understand what this means, and that this never leaves you for your whole life.
Well, this is why history is never not relevant, is it? You know what I mean? Because these things that have happened,
it is amazing.
You know.
For instance, in my family, there's only one beautiful. My ancestors were brewers and silk weavers, so very well to do sort of burghers. And in the family, there's one piece of jewelry, because after the war they just went and, you know, an emerald necklace, yeah, that was just fine for a piece of bacon. And the farmers have tremendous riches. Interestingly enough, my father later, as a vet, and then we could return to Tsarina, he put a ring into a bull's nose. And the farmer said, well, I can't pay. I don't have any cash. And my father said, what else do you have? And then the farmer opened his room and said, well, take your pick. And there were all these riches of what people had paid after the Second World War just for a piece of bacon or a bread or whatever. And so my father took a Luther Bible, an original translated first edition, you know, of when Luther translated the Bible from Latin into German. He said, okay, that'll do fine. And that's where we read our Christmas story from. Every Christmas, we open the Luther Bible with gloves and, you know, read the Christmas story.
Yeah.
So its history is incredible. And it never stops being the present. The past never stops being the present.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. Yeah. And for people who say, oh, historical fiction, it's not relevant. No, not at all. Not at all. So bringing it back to Tsarina. Bring it back to Tsarina. Would you do some reading?
I'll do a reading. And I have to say, before it's two brief readings. I'm going to do, they're about sort of 5 to 7 minutes each, and they bring you the flavor. And before I started writing the first sentence of Tsarina, I had done a year of research. So here we go. In the Winter Palace, 1725. He is dead. My beloved husband, the mighty Tsar of all the Russias, has died, and just in time. Moments before death came for him, Peter called for a quill and paper to be brought to him in his bedchamber in the Winter Palace. My heart almost stalled. He had not forgotten, but was going to drag me down with him. When he lost consciousness for the last time, and the darkness drew him closer to its very heart, the quill slipped from his fingers. Black ink spattered the soiled sheets. Time held its breath. What had the Tsar wanted to settle with that last effort of his tremendous spirit? I knew the answer. The candles in the tall candelabra filled the room with a heavy scent and an unsteady light. Their glow made shadows reel in corners and brought the woven figurines on the Flemish tapestries to life, their coarse faces showing pain and disbelief. Outside the door, the voices of the people who'd stood there all night were drowned out by the February wind rattling furiously at the shutters. Time spread slowly, like oil on water. Peter had pressed himself into our souls like his signet ring in hot wax. It seemed impossible that the world hadn't careened to a halt at his passing. My husband, the greatest will ever to impose itself on Russia, had been more than our ruler. He had been our fate. He was still mine. The doctors Blumentrost, Paulsen, and Horn stood silently around Peter's bed, staring at him, browbeaten. 5 kopecks worth of medicine, given early enough, could have saved him. But thank God for the quack's lack of good sense. Without looking, I could feel Feofan Prokopovich, the Archbishop of Novgorod, watching me, along with Alexander Menshikov. Prokopovich had made the Tsar's will eternal, and Peter had much to thank him for. Menshikov, on the other hand, owed his fortune and influence to Peter. What was it Peter had said when someone tried to blacken Alexander Danilovich's name to him by referring to his murky business dealings? Menshikov is always Menshikov in all that he does. That had put an end to that. Dr. Paulsen had closed the Tsar's eyes and crossed his hands on his chest, but he hadn't removed the scroll. Peter's last will and testament from his grasp. Those hands, which were always too dainty for the tall, powerful body, had grown still, helpless. Just 2 weeks earlier, he had plunged those very hands into my hair, winding it round his fingers, inhaling the scent of rosewater and sandalwood. "My Catherine," he'd said, calling me by the name he himself had given me, and he'd smiled at me. "You're still a beauty. But what will you look like in a convent, shorn and bald? The cold there will break you, your spirit, even though you're strong as a horse. Do you know that Evdokia still writes to me, begging for a second fur? Poor thing. What a good job you can't write," he'd said, laughing. It had been 30 years since Evdokia had been banished to the convent. I'd met her once. Her eyes shone with madness. Her shaven head was covered in boils and scabs from the cold and the filth, and her only company was a hunchbacked dwarf to serve her in her cell. Peter had ordered the poor creature have her tongue cut out, so in response to Evdokia's moaning and laments, all she was able to do was babble. He'd been right to believe that seeing Evdokia once would fill me with lifelong dread. I knelt at Peter's bedside, and the 3 doctors retreated to the twilight at the edge of the room like crows driven from a field, the birds Peter had been so terrified of in the last years of his life. The Tsar had called open season on the hapless birds all over his empire. Farmers caught, killed, plucked, and roasted them for reward. None of this helped Peter. Silently, at night, the bird would slip through the padded walls and locked doors of his bedchamber. Its ebony wings blotted the light, and in their cool shadow, the blood on the Tsar's hands never dried. His fingers were not yet those of a corpse, but soft and still warm. For a moment, the fear and anger of those past months slipped from my heart like a thief in the night. I kissed his hands and breathed in his familiar scent of tobacco, ink, leather, and the perfume tincture that was blended for his sole use in Grasse. I took the scroll from his hand. It was easy enough to slide it out, although my blood thickened with fear, and my veins were coated with frost and rime, like branches in our Baltic winter. It was important to show everyone that I alone was entitled to do this, I, his wife, and the mother of his children. 12 times I had given birth. The paper rustled as I unrolled it. Not for the first time I was ashamed of my inability to read, and I handed his last will to Feofan Prokopovich. At least Menshikov was as ignorant as I. Ever since the days when Peter first drew us into his orbit and cast his spell upon us, we had been like 2 children squabbling over their father's love and attention. Batyushka Tsar, his people called him, our little father Tsar. Prokopovich must have known what Peter had in mind for me. He was an old fox with a sharp wit, as comfortable in heavenly and earthly wrongs. Daria had once sworn that he had 3,000 books in his library. What, if you please, can one man do with 3,000 books? The scroll sat lightly in his liver spotted hands now that shocked us all. The Tsar had set aside every custom, every law. He wanted to appoint his own successor, and would rather leave his empire to a worthy stranger than his own unworthy child. How timid Alexei had been when we first met, the spitting image of his mother Evdokia, with his veiled gaze and high, domed forehead. He couldn't sit up straight, because Menshikov had thrashed his back and buttocks bloody and sore. Only when it was too late did Alexei grasp his fate. In his quest for a new Russia, the Tsar would spare no one, neither himself nor his only son. You were no blood of my blood, Alexei, and no flesh of my flesh, and so I was able to sleep soundly. Peter, though, had been haunted by nightmares from that day on. My heart pounded against my lightly laced bodice. I was surprised it didn't echo from the walls, but I met Prokopovich's scars as calmly as I could. I wriggled my toes in my slippers as I could not afford to faint. Prokopovich's smile was as thin as one of the wafers he would offer in church. He knew the secrets of the human heart, especially mine. Read, Feofan, I said quietly. Give everything to... He paused, looked up, and repeated. To... Menshikov's temper flared. He reared as if someone had struck him with a whip, like in good old days. To whom? Pray tell, Feofan, to whom? I could hardly breathe. The fur was suddenly much too hot against my skin. Feofan shrugged. That's all. The Tsar didn't finish writing the sentence. And that's a true story, actually, that the quill slipped from his fingers before he could write the name of his successor. You know, after all these years and all this effort, you die without determining whom you should leave your empire to. So it's an incredible story.
Absolutely. No, that's great. And hopefully that's whetted your appetite if you haven't read it already. Yeah, so, I mean, it's such a fascinating story and she's such a great character. How has she been overlooked? What do you think? Do you think there's a conspiracy behind it?
No, I don't think it's a conspiracy. It's probably because the interesting story is, of course, the story of her rise. And as such, she exists a lot only in the mirror of Peter the Great for a long time. For instance, the first 200 pages of the book, because that's the time it takes until she meets the Tsar. And I think for these first 200 pages, you always wonder, how on earth is she ever going to meet the Tsar? It's just such an incredible story. I did a lot of research, you know, into the life of serfs and the conditions. They're really less than slaves. It's horrible. And how this woman who was less than the dirt between, you know, a pig's trotter's toes could rise to this unimaginable riches and station in life. And when I studied in Paris, I worked as an assistant to a best-selling author, and she gave me a very valuable lesson by saying, your hero or heroine has to fall really low until the reader is happy for him to rise. And that explains sort of the first 200 pages until she arrives in the household of this Protestant priest. And this is when history starts. So that is confirmed that she worked as a maid in that household, but how she got there. And then, of course, as an empress, she only ruled for 2 years and was mostly under the influence of Peter's advisors. And they had placed her there because they knew the gravy train would continue if she ruled. If Alexei's son, Peter the Great's grandson, had taken over, a completely new party, a completely new faction of people would have come to court, and it would have been over and done. Still, she left her traces. I mean, as an empress, she was the one who financed the ships of Vitus Bering, who later discovered the Bering Strait, and the reason why Alaska was Russian. So that was thanks to her, because a bit like Isabella of Castile financed the ships of Columbus, she financed the ships of Vitus Bering. So that's probably the one lasting legacy of her reign. And some critics say, oh, why didn't you write about the reign? I said, because her reign is not interesting. Interesting is her rise. And that brought her to this position.
And how did you get involved? What you had decided to write about her? Yeah. How did you get those little details?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before I wrote the first sentence, I think it was a year of research. And if I had known which world of almost Tolkien-esque dimensions awaited me, perhaps I wouldn't have dared. Perhaps you remember when you're young and you go traveling and you go backpacking, whatever, naivety protects you. If you actually don't know what to expect and you just start and happy-go-lucky, and this was a little bit like that. So I read all the Russians, all the classics, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Gogol, saw fantastic movies, Battleship Potemkin, The Ark, the Dogma movie about 300 years of the Winter Palace. I can only recommend that. And even reading Russian fairy tales, because fairy tales really tells you about a people's imaginary. And in the end, the storyteller, the beard always drips with honey because he's so rewarded, and everybody rewards him for telling a story. I wish it was still the same with all today. You know, our beards drip with honey. And and then, of course, while I wrote, I always had I always had the books open. There was one absolutely invaluable tome entitled Russia in the Age of Peter the Great, and that covers everything. And the letters he wrote to her, and the loving nicknames he had for his children that later come in the Tsarina's Daughter. So, and this makes it, of course, like economies of scale. Once you have that research in place and you have a grasp of that world, you can write more books. And for the Tsarina's Daughter, it was much more to see how it then continued.
Mm. So I think that segues really nicely into you telling us a little bit about Tsarina's Daughter.
Tsarina's Daughter.
So where did it go?
Fascinating. I mean, incredibly enough, the Tsarina's Daughter Elizabeth, so she's the only surviving child of Peter the Great's 15 sons and daughters. She's the only one who reached adulthood, full adulthood. Her elder sister died at the age of 21 then, and she survived until her late 40s, early 50s. And she lives the opposite of her mother's life. So her mother rises from serf to empress. It's this classic rags to riches story. Whilst Elizabeth is sort of this enfant chérie of Peter the Great. She's the world's loveliest princess. If you look, there's a famous portrait of her painted by Louis Caravac. And she really looks like a young Marilyn Monroe. Quite often, if you look at these old portraits, it's difficult to say what did the person actually look like. But there you see she's all sort of dewy-eyed and rosy-cheeked, and Peter the Great wanted her to marry Louis XV in Paris. He had this big dream of his daughter being Queen of France. But of course, the Bourbons in Versailles, I mean, they're bowled over laughing at the idea that their king should marry the daughter of a washermaid and former serf. And still, she's insulated by this luxury and these unimaginable riches, palaces dotting the countryside, 500-600 rooms each. Every gem is as big as a pigeon egg. And, and just human life. Millionfold in such abundance, unimaginable. And then she falls from these heights, and she really falls comparatively to rugs. She's completely she's destitute, she's derided, and from that situation in life she has to claw her way back. So really the story is about her maturing from this very spoiled, lovable, not evil princess to becoming this very cunning woman who becomes who she is, and who has to seize what is hers and pay a terrible price for it. And she's emboldened to do so through a love story that again reflects her parents' love story, but in the inverse, by choosing a man who's really not destined to be with her. But she says, I need this man because in Russia he's rarer than black snow. He's a good man, and I need him. And what she does to gain him and how he emboldens her is just one of the most beautiful love stories, I think. And again, it's the first novel about her incredible rise. So once more, I've been so lucky.
Yeah, I mean, you call her the other Elizabeth. You know what I mean? Which is a bit like, yeah, absolutely. So we know the first Elizabeth.
Yes.
But, I mean, how do you justify that?
She is especially for English people, I think it was a fantastic tagline, because the Tudors and the Romanovs, for both Elizabeths, were very young dynasties who still had to establish themselves against many others who wanted the reign in the country. They have this overwhelming father figure. If you imagine Henry VIII or Peter the Great during bedtime, I'd be like, okay, just hide at the other end of the bed, pulling up the blanket. Both dynasties were in desperate need, lacking a male heir. They were both younger daughters. Both their mothers were considered not to be the right choice, so they were considered being born out of wedlock, both Elizabeths. When they had to survive a decade with an older, very dangerous, very jealous ruler, which my Elizabeth has as well in her cousin, and so I don't want to give away any spoilers. And when they finally got to rule, they never married. They both died in a river palace, and they both left their throne to an unloved nephew. So their similarities are, next to the name, are incredible.
That's really interesting.
It's fantastic. It's so interesting. They're separated by, I think, 160 years in birth, but the similarities are shocking.
Thank you. Will you read us a bit of the Tsarina's Daughter?
The reading is about sort of the same length. Do you have the stamina for that? Just have another sip of prosecco. I'll stop, otherwise I can't read.
Good idea.
You will recognize that it's the same voice who is telling the story. It's sort of, which is nice. You're back with the family. Prologue. In the Winter Palace, St. Nicholas Day, December the 6th, 1741. Ivan is innocent. My little cousin is a baby, and as pure as only a 1-year-old can be. But tonight, at my order, the infant Tsar will be declared guilty as charged. I fight the urge to pick him up and kiss him. It would only make things worse. Beyond his nursery door, there is a low buzzing sound, like that of angry bees ready to swarm the Winter Palace. Soldiers' boots scrape and shuffle, spurs clink like stubby vodka glasses, and bayonets are being fixed to muskets. These are the sounds of things to come. The thought spikes my heart with dread. There's no other choice. It is Ivan or me. Only one of us can rule Russia. The other one is condemned to a living death. Reigning Russia is a right that has to be earned as much as inherited. He and my cousin, the regent, doom the country to an eternity under the foreign yoke. Under their rule, the realm will be lost, and the invisible holy bond between Tsar and people severed. I, Elizabeth, am the only surviving child of Peter the Great's 15 sons and daughters. Tonight, if I hesitate too long, I might become the last of the siblings to die. Curse the Romanovs. In vain, I try to bar from my thoughts the prophecy that has blighted my life. Puddles form on the parquet floor. A slush drips from my boots. Their worn, thigh-high leather is soaked from my dash across St. Petersburg. Despite my being an imperial princess, the Tsarevna Elizabeth Petrovna Romanova, no footman had hooked a bearskin across my lap to protect me against the icy wind and driving snow while I sat snug in a sled. I had no muff to raise to my face in that special, graceful gesture of the St. Petersburg ladies, the dami. My dash toward my date with destiny had been clandestine. Snowfall veiled the flickering lights of the lanterns and shrouded the city. Mortal fear drove me on, hurrying over bridges, dodging patrolled barriers, and furtively crossing the empty prospects, where my hasty passage left a momentary trace of warmth in the frosty air. This was a night of momentous decision-making that I would have to live with forever. An anointed and crowned Tsar may not be killed, even once he is deposed, as it sets a dangerous precedent. Yet he may not live either, at least not in the minds of the Russian people, or according to the diplomatic dispatches sent all over Europe. What then is to become of the baby boy? I feel for Ivan's limp little hand. I simply cannot resist, never could, nuzzling his chubby, rosy fingers, which are still too small to bear the imperial seal. We call this game a butterfly's kiss. It makes him giggle and squeal, and me dissolve with tenderness. I drink in his scent, the talcum powder blended in grass for his sole use, vanilla and bergamot, the Tsar's perfume, carefully recording it to last me a lifetime. The men outside fall quiet. They're waiting for the decision that will both save and damn me. The thought sears my soul. In Ivan's nursery, the lined French damask drapes are drawn. Thick pot-bellied clouds hide the December new moon and stars, giving this hour a dense and dreadful darkness. During the day, the seagulls' cries freeze on their beaks. The chill of night grates skin raw. Any light is as scarce and dear as everything else in St. Petersburg. The candle sellers' shops, which smell of beeswax, flax, and sulfur, do brisk business with both Yuletide and Epiphany approaching. On the opposite quay, the shutters on the flat facades of the city's palaces and houses are closed, the windows behind them dark. They are swathed in the same brooding silence as the Winter Palace. I am in my father's house, but this does not mean that I'm safe. Far from it. It means quite the opposite. The Winter Palace's myriad corridors, hundreds of rooms, and dozens of staircases can be as welcoming as a lover's embrace or as dangerous as a snake pit. It is Ivan or me. Fate has mercilessly driven us toward this moment. The courtiers shun me. No one would bet a kopeck on my future. Will I be sent to a remote convent, even though I do not have an ounce of nun's flesh about me, as the Spanish envoy, the Duke of Liria, so memorably recorded? I had once been forced to see such an unfortunate woman in her cell. As intended, the sight instilled a terror that would last me a lifetime. Her shorn head was covered in chilblains, and her eyes shone with madness. A hunchbacked dwarf, whose tongue had been torn out, was her sole companion, both shuffling about in rutted straw, like pigs in their sties. Or perhaps there's a sled waiting for me, destination Siberia. I know about this voyage of no return. I have heard the cries, seen the dread, and smelled the fear of the banished culprits, be they simple peasants or even the Tsar's best friend. By the first anniversary of their sentence, all had succumbed to the harsh conditions of the East. Maybe a dark cell at the Trubetskoy bastion, the place nobody ever leaves in one piece, will swallow me, or things will be simpler, and I'm fated to end up face down in the Neva, drifting between the thick floes of ice, my body crushed and shredded by their sheer force. The soldier's impatience is palpable. Just one more breath. Ivan's wet nurse is asleep, slumped on her stool, resting amid his toys, the scattered pieces of a nesting doll, wooden boats, a mechanical silver bear that opens its jaws and raises its paws when wound up, and a globe inlaid with Indian ivory and Belgian emaille. One of the nurse's pale breasts is still bare from the last feeding. She was chosen for her ample alabaster bosom in Moscow's raucous German quarter. Ivan is well cared for. Romanov men are of weaker stock than Romanov women, even if no one ever dares to say so. I celebrated his first year as a time of wonder, offering my little cousin a cross studded with rubies and emeralds for his christening, a gift fit for a Tsar, and put myself in debt to raise an ebony colt in my stables as his Yuletide present. Ivan's breathing is growing heavier. The regiment outside his door weighs on his dreams. As I touch his sides, his warmth sends a jolt through my fingers, hitting a gold in my heart. Oh, to hold him one more time and feel his delightful weight in my arms. I pull my hands back, folding them, though the time for prayers has passed. No pilgrimage can ever absolve me from this sin, even if I slide across the whole of Russia on my knees. Ivan's lashes flutter, his chin wobbles, he smacks his pink and shiny lips. I cannot bear to see him cry, despite the saying of Russian serfs, another man's tears are only water. The lightest load will be your greatest burden. The last prophecy is coming to pass. Spare me, I inwardly plead, but I know this is my path, and I will have to walk it to the end over the pieces of my broken heart. Ivan slides back into slumber. Long dark lashes cast shadows on his round cheeks, and his tiny fists open, showing pink, unlined palms. Not only the most adept fortune teller could imagine what the future has in store for Ivan. It is a thought that I refrain from following to its conclusion. Beyond the door, utter silence reigns. This is the calm before the storm my father taught me to fear when we sailed the slate-colored waters of the Bay of Finland. His fleet had been rolling at anchor in the far distance, masts rising like a marine forest. This is forever Russia, he had announced. No Romanov must ever surrender what has been gained by spilling Russian blood. In order to strengthen Russia, father had spared no one. My elder half-brother Alexei, his son and heir, had paid the ultimate price for doubting Russia's path to progress. Steps approach. My time with Ivan and life as we know it is over. The knock on the nursery door is a token rasp of knuckles, so light it belies its true purpose. It is time to act. Russia will tolerate no further excuses. Elizabeth Petrovna Romanova. I hear the captain of the Imperial Preobrazhensky Regiment. His son is my godchild, but can I trust him completely for all that? I feel as if I'm drowning and shield Ivan's cradle with my body. In the gilt-framed mirrors, I see my face floating ghostly pale above the dark green uniform jacket. My ash-blonde curly hair has slid down from beneath a fur cap. On a simple leather thong around my neck hangs the diamond-studded icon of St. Nicholas that is priceless to me. They will have to prize it from my body to take it from me. I am almost 32 years old, and tonight I shall not betray my blood. I'm ready, I say, my voice trembling, bracing myself as the door bursts open and the soldiers swarm in. Everything comes at a price.
Oh, thank you. So that's Tsarina's Daughter.
That is Tsarina's Daughter.
One thing I want to ask you about is the different covers, right? So, and I'm sure everyone asked you about this, right?
Oh, the books I read from now?
Because they're the American ones, aren't they?
Yes, I just didn't have any English editions left at home. And I just got, this was published in America last week to fantastic acclaim.
Would you mind just holding it up for our viewers?
Good. So this is the American Tsarina, which is beautiful, stunning, a bit like Natalie Portman. And then this is, but I think both in all the countries, where am I? In all the countries, they have sort of developed a fantastic visual voice. I think Bloomsbury has done a tremendous job, especially with the paperback and the hardback together. I mean, the books have sold almost, I mean, they're sold in 80 countries. They've been translated into almost 20 languages. And in every country, they seem to have sort of, seized on one aspect of them. Sometimes it's more bravado, sometimes it's more the fairy tale aspect. Tsarina's Daughter, sort of this whole rich Russian iconography that is there. It's interesting. It's always a good cover, but they're always very different.
Yeah, it's very different.
It's quite stunning.
And I mean, with the English cover, I mean, I'll just hold it up so people can see. I know. So I want to knot that. So that, I mean, it's beautiful, Tsarina's Daughter, and just the imaging and just I think it's just absolutely gorgeous, and the red and black and there's a bit of gold on there. Is it beige?
Yes, I mean, you don't even have to wrap them, really. You just put a ribbon around.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I can know, but I much prefer this. But maybe that's just because I live in the UK.
The American covers are different. It's fascinating how much covers are to a nation's taste. It's completely. I was just, as I say, last week in Germany, where the German version of Tsarina's Daughter was published together with the American one, and the covers are completely different. The books are completely different positions.
What do the German ones look like?
Quite mainstream, sort of women from the back, and equally, here in the UK, Tsarina was nominated twice for a literary award. The books are perceived completely differently. In German, they don't even come out in hardback. Oh, really? No, they're right away sort of more like what we would call sort of, like what you buy in a train station.
So easy reading.
Yeah, so it really is. People are then surprised if they buy it.
Yeah.
They don't expect it. So, yeah, fascinating how different countries, evaluate books differently.
That is really interesting. And I suppose just on the subject of genre, and the fact that Germany, they'll just go straight to paperback, and people might take it on the train as a nice little easy read. But it's not. I mean, it's historical. If you put it into a genre, it's historical literary fiction. Is that what genre you would put it in?
Yes, I mean, the thing with historical fiction, I think people are like, because it could just be so very diverse. If you have psychological suspense or crime or whodunit, you're basically 100% sure of what to expect. Whilst with historical fiction, things can be very drab and just a sort of dire, dry retelling of what happened, where and when. It can be completely out there and just sort of a bodice ripper that gives you actually no knowledge whatsoever. But as I said, these big classics I mentioned before, who strike this balance so wonderfully that you learn so much, and afterwards when you're at a dinner party, you shine, everything about Russia and Catherine the First, and people say why, and yet you're brilliantly entertained. And if that balance is struck. It's just wonderful. It's really beautiful. I'm just lucky. I'm just reading a advanced reading copy of the second one of Elodie Harper. You know, The Wolf Den. So it's called The House with the Golden Door. It's better than The Wolf Den. And there too, it's wonderful. You're sort of so drawn into that life in Pompeii, and you can really talk about it afterwards.
So what really drew you to writing historical fiction? Obviously, you know, you had this amazing idea about this amazing character, but was there anything else about the genre that really drew you to it?
I think it's mostly because I had read so much historical fiction, and I always had a fascination for history and how it repeats itself. And this whole discussion, is history a science? Is it not a science? Because there are no rules that can be relied on. But then actually there are, like, sort of never trust Mr. Putin. That's a good rule to rely on. I would not have known. I wrote a first novel that brought me into contact with agents and publishers, but I didn't have the maturity to really write it. But I had finished it, and that's already a big thing. You know, even if you never publish your novel, just finishing it is enormous. It's a massive achievement everybody can be so proud of. And then when we had been through different stages, the publisher said, do you have nothing else to write about? You know, I've seen that you can do it, you can finish. And I said, yeah, actually, well, there is this woman. And then I started my research. And at the time, I worked as a TV anchor at Bloomberg breakfast television, and I got up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the car would come at 2:30 to pick me up. Normally, I just wore, you know, like it now, but I would wear jogging pants, sweatpants, sort of my monster pushes to write up the program and then get my makeup done, because we broadcast it into Germany, where it was already an hour later. And then I came home at lunchtime, and I slept 3 hours, and I went for a run in the park, and then I would write. And it was really a crazy life in hindsight. The woman who lived beneath me, we later became friends. She said, I thought you were working as an escort girl, because I always saw you coming up and down the stairs at 2:30 in the morning. Yes. So, and then you take it from there. But it's a dream profession, but it's equally very hard, because it's a very lonely profession, and you're only there with your story until you go out, and then suddenly your story is worth a worth. And there's never any guarantee. There is no land of milk and honey, especially not nowadays. Because, you know, let's say 30 years ago, when the huge names in historical fiction got big, like Robert Harris, there was so little competition for people's attention. There was television and cinema, granted, but still, it was relatively easy to become big as an author. But nowadays, I really feel the reader gives me his or hers most valuable. And that's not their money, but it's actually their time and their attention, because the competition is ferocious. So I can just, you know, thank everybody who takes the time to get involved with my girls. And I hope that it's of consequence, and that they take something with them that is unforgettable, a story that is truly rich and unforgettable. That's what I buy out of my writing.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? I could keep asking, but no, feel free.
Writing about something that struck you in the books, if you've read them, anything's welcome. You know,
there is one question we've had from someone online.
Okay.
Rebecca says, she goes, hello, I agree. I like the English cover too. Looks more sophisticated.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah. That's it from online. Okay, but yeah. Thanks, Rebecca. Appreciate that. That's great.
I have, yes. Actually, funny enough, I visited Russia after I had written Tsarina. So I'd finished Tsarina, and my husband said, okay, I think we should go to Russia. And it was a completely low-key trip, because he was just building up his company. And so we stayed in an old youth hostel at the old end of the Nevsky Prospect, at the Stary Nevsky, where it wasn't done up yet, and it wasn't that beautiful. And people took the tube and the bus from the airport, and basically people shoved us left and right where we had to go. It's almost like having a sideboard around it. And if there was no taxi, you just held out your arm, and any car would stop and bring you wherever you wanted to go. And I remember he was so proud of his stereo, and he just I sat in the back of the car with the bass bouncing away, and it was much colder than I had expected. So I had packed sandals, and then in the end I started wearing all my husband's clothes. So I looked like this sort of like a country bumpkin, wearing socks and a man's sweater over a dress. And we went out to Peterhof Palace, where the actors were already there, so they were dressed up as Peter and Catherine. But there was still snow lying and no visitors, so we ended up having a snowball fight with these actors dressed up. And yeah, so I remember the food. I remember it was really at the cusp of changeover. There was still, it was sort of 20 years into the end of the Soviet Union, but not quite, where it is today. I'm glad we went. It was a special world. I mean, now I wouldn't go, but I imagine if you visited St. Petersburg now, it's a very, very different, much more westernized place.
Happy to go and see.
Yeah.
The sex, brings it to life.
I hope people do say that reading the books, they are really in that world, that it's almost like reading, like reading a movie, and you're in these rooms and in these La Stampa, the Italian newspapers, and these epics clad in ice and snow, and that really draws you in. I hope.
Is that something you would look for in the future with the books? You mentioned a movie.
Well, who wouldn't? But it's a big production, and funny enough, the ultimate name recognition of Catherine the Great, who was the niece-in-law of the Tsarinas Daughter. So that is, if we speak of the achievements of Catherine I in paying Vitus Bering's ships, then perhaps the ultimate achievement of the Tsarinas Daughter was that she invited this, destitute, very nondescript German little princess to Russia in order to marry her nephew, because she needed another heir to the throne, and she thought, well, this girl's not going to cause me any problems. So she invited this German princess to Russia, who later became Catherine the Great. So that is probably her biggest legacy to the country. And funny enough, this huge name of Catherine the Great stands almost in the way of the series. And of course, historical productions are quite expensive, but there is a treatment. There's a treatment only for Tsarina, and there's a treatment for the originally planned 4 books, which would be for 4 years of fantastic television. But so far, knock on wood, nothing concrete. But I hope it will happen one day.
It'd be lovely. I'm reading the book myself, so I've obviously read the first one. I've not quite finished, so it's like, don't give away.
Okay, no. That's fine.
Close to the end, but you do get kind of transported into that world, and you almost, like, for me, when I'm reading a book like that, I feel that I'm almost living a movie in my mind as you're reading it. So it's such a lovely experience to kind of be taken away by a book like that.
That's wonderful to hear. There's a bit at the end when sort of, because at the end, that it's not a spoiler, I can say that at the end, for the once and only time, it's a very brief change of perspective to round it off, to give at least a catch of these 2 years. And there's a moment in that change of perspective where I actually had to cry myself when I wrote it. It's sort of, when things come full circle, and she's down at the river again. And it's just, you see how stunning a life it was.
Because you must be so emotionally involved with the characters
completely.
now. They are your family,
girls.
aren't they? You're
They're
your
my
girls.
girls.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think my family is bought it. My sons are like, no, not Tsarina again. But so we'll have to see. Especially in America, a lot of people say immediately, I can't wait for the 3rd book.
So how many are you planning on writing? You said it was 4.
Well, I had originally planned a quartet.
Right.
Yes. Okay. But there's material for 7 books. Of course, the reader dictates that. As I say, nothing is ever sure, nothing is ever for granted. And there's no land of milk and honey.
So fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed for
it goes really well.
For the wild and wonderful women of the early Romanov era.
Wonderful. And I mean, within that material, will you cover Catherine the Great?
I suppose I would.
Okay.
Yes, I'm reading her memoirs at the moment to somehow get a new feel for her, a feel beyond that is always portrayed in The Great. And The Great is hilarious, but it's historically it's as inaccurate as you can be. but it's hilarious and wonderful, and Elfanic does a great job.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's brilliant, isn't
Yes.
it? Love the series.
But
love the
everything
series.
is wrong about it. Everything is wrong about it. But if it draws attention to this world and this family and these people, fine. And
Absolutely.
and it's so surprising because really next to the Tudors, the Romanovs are the world's most famous dynasty. That there was this whole early fascinating stories that they undiscovered. So as I say, I feel like Howard Carter and Tutankhamun.
Yeah, no, absolutely fantastic. And just to round off, just because we like to ask all our authors to come and visit us, what tips do you have for any aspiring writers?
Right. So really, I mean, take the time, and time is crucial. For instance, if I know I only have an hour, I somehow find it hard to get started. So, and even if it means, that you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and that you write those 2 hours before it's time to make breakfast for your family, it's such a privilege to spend that time, with a cup of tea and your character, and try to get those. You don't have to be too ambitious. 1,500 words together. Shorter chapters make for faster reading. So writing that idea and finishing, and then the next thing is, be serious about your writing. Don't slag it off yourself, just saying, oh, I'm just dabbling, but be actually proud of what you do. And I think that pride will shine through, and it's a massive trip. And getting published is artistically the hardest achievement, because if you think people take a second to look at a painting and they like it, and they take 3 minutes to listen to a record or a song and say, oh, that sounds good, but convincing somebody to sort of read your 500 or 600 page novel, and there's only one thing that makes an author successful today, and that is time and money thrown at him by a big agent, a big publisher. And so convincing somebody to do that is artistically the hardest feat, and it can be a fairly soul-destroying journey. So if you love writing, and if it's just for yourself, just do it for yourself, because it's, it's a catharsis, it's therapy, especially nowadays.
Well, no, thank you so much for being with us.
I thank you.
Wish you all that you and your girls, all the best of luck. It's going to be amazing. And yes, obviously we have books for sale here tonight, but if people are buying online, where would you recommend they buy from?
Well, I'd always say go to your local bookseller, and most of them have them matched in stock or order, but otherwise, I'm not against Amazon.
Okay, all right. So yeah, just search
okay.
Tsarina's Daughter or the Tsarina on Amazon. All right, cool. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you everybody for coming.
Bye. Bye.